Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be going over JavaScript and Jest. Um, this may be a review for some of you, especially if you've attended FOP. Pretty much this whole week should feel like a review if you attended FOP. But for some of you, this might be the first time you ever see JavaScript. So let's go ahead and start off with the topics that we'll be covering today. In JavaScript, we'll be covering primitive data types, what are variables and how to work with them, functions. We'll be covering complex data types, the ternary operators, loops, arrow functions, destructuring, the spread operator, exports for required syntax, and then pass by value versus pass by reference. So a couple of these are a little bit more of advanced topics. So I'm going to go ahead and put these under a separate section here. Put those under advanced. This is the stuff that you really need to know to solve a problem. The remainder of this is not a top necessity to know, but definitely as a JavaScript developer, you should know this stuff as we move on forward. Now, moving on, we'll be covering Jest. In order to utilize Jest, which is a testing suite for JavaScript unit test, we're going to go ahead and learn a little bit about NPM modules and how to actually start a project with NPM. We're going to be covering what is a unit test, how to utilize the Jest test runner, and then the expect and assertion libraries. And then finally, we'll go over skipping tests that you don't want to run. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the topics that we'll be covering today? All right, if no one has any questions, let's go ahead and kick off our lecture here. The first part of our lecture talks quite a bit about how the internet works and why JavaScript matters. To put it in simplest forms, JavaScript is essentially what makes anything in your web page functional, right? So this button here that says share, yeah, it's a button, and maybe they utilize some sort of HTML to get this to drop here. But when I click on this share this project and a link gets provided to me, like this down here getting popped up, that doesn't just happen from random things. That happens because some sort of JavaScript script in the back of this, man, I wonder if I could open up my inspector tools here. In the background of this actual project or this web page is running that information for me. Let's see. Developer tools, where are we at? Okay. Let me try Google instead. There you go. So now here we can see I have my usual HTML template. We don't have to necessarily understand this just yet, but you can see how all of this is essentially what my website it looks like. This is the code that creates this template, right? And by template, I mean the visual aspect of the website. But all of these hovering functionalities where when I hover over a square, it changes colors, or the reactions that I get. For example, when I start clicking here and things start popping up, that all has to do with some sort of JavaScript functionality. And this JavaScript functionality happens down here in this script tag. We can see that in the script tag, we have a couple of different JavaScript modules that are being activated. So here I have my lazy load.js. If I were to take a wild guess, I would assume that that has to do with this search bar here. And then I have a new tab page.js, which likely just has to interact with the fact that this is a new tab. So this just has the functionalities for this one specific page. All right. So that's JavaScript in a nutshell as far as how it communicates with the web. We'll be covering how we can get JavaScript to communicate with HTML and all of our backend frameworks later on in the course. But that's just an important piece of knowledge to understand as to why you should know JavaScript and why it's important. Does anyone have any questions over that? All right, if there aren't any questions, then the next thing we're going to start talking about is Node. So yesterday we spent the majority of our time talking about Git. If I put Git inside of my terminal, I receive a series of commands here. And all of these commands have to do with Git. Node is similar in the fact that it can take commands, or that it can take a script as an argument for how to execute. But what Node actually does is it processes JavaScript code. Now, what I mean by that, earlier when we were talking about files and their extensions and how they end, I remember there was a couple of questions that had to do with, well, how does the machine know if this is JavaScript code, or how does the machine know if this is Python code? Well, the machine doesn't know. All right. Visual Studio Code knows, because I have a couple of extensions that know that, and it knows to identify .js as that specific file. But Node is what actually takes that file, reads through it, identifies that .js at the very end of the text of the naming convention of that file, and says, "Oh, this is a JavaScript file, and I need to actually interpret this to speak to the machine in order to do whatever the script is telling me that it needs to do." Right. So Node is I would like to think of it as a translator between my machine and my JavaScript code. Again, all files are just text. They're interpreted as text as far as the machine knows. It's the different tools that we utilize to interpret those files that actually identify them as JavaScript or Python code. Does anyone have any questions over that at this moment? All right. If there aren't any questions covering that information, then let's go ahead and get a little bit of practice with Node. Again, yesterday we covered Git. If we type in Git, we get a couple of commands or suggestions. Well, if we type in Node, we don't get the same exact reaction. If we type in Node, we get "Welcome to Node.js. This is version 20.2, and you could put .help for information." So if we put .help, it gives me quite a bit of different functions that have to do with this terminal interaction. And it says that I could do this and interact with REPL. But all I'm essentially doing here when I type in Node is I'm opening up a JavaScript file in my terminal. I can write JavaScript. And when I type in JavaScript, it's able to execute my code. But as we know, this isn't really getting saved. I'm not keeping track of this. If I exit this functionality with .exit and I try to go back into Node, everything that I did before is gone. It gives me a fresh new page. All right, so this is useful to utilize as a playground. Maybe I'm working with some sort of syntax and I want to figure out if it works correctly the way I want it to. But it's definitely not useful if I'm trying to create a program that will be utilized over and over again, or I need to continue existing. So instead, what I need to do is create an actual JavaScript file. So in order to create a JavaScript file, does anybody remember the command to create a file?
Touch.
Touch. Perfect. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and do touch example. And again, Node only identifies files that end with that JS convention. And that's how it's able to know that it's executable. So if I do touch example.js, and actually let's do a little bit of a experimenting here. If I do node example.txt, nothing happens. Oh, and maybe I could do, let's see what happens if I do this. Oh, so we can see that it was able to work through it. It took the text from inside of this file and it was still able to execute it. So that just goes to show that every single file that we create is actually just a text file. But we want to have this .js here. We'll go over into these conventions and how that gets managed inside the Node package manager here shortly for Node npm. But now let's go ahead and write our actual JavaScript code. So I'm going to do something simple, console.log hello, just so that we could see something show up in our terminal. We don't have to worry about what exactly this means just yet. I will be covering that shortly. So now when I run node example.js, we get hello on our terminal because it is valid JavaScript. All right, everything is working well. Node accepts the argument of the script that I want to execute, reads through the code, and it sees that the only command I'm telling it to execute is to log onto my console, which is my terminal, the word hello. All right. At this point, there we go. Go ahead, Tim.
So this information is not stored in a safe spot until you actually hit Control S or save it, right? Like this is only displayed on terminal right now?
Are we talking about this specific script here?
Yes.
So this specific script, you have to save it. I have, and I apologize for not covering this during our intro day, but I have autosave on down here.
Oh, okay.
So it's
Gotcha.
also, yes, as soon as I make a change, it gets saved.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Muran.
Yeah, so you mean if I want to deal with any file with extension JavaScript or I want to make any work with JavaScript, I have to switch between get to node to the tool node.
Yes,
That's what you want to say?
exactly. If
So
you
always when I'm planning to work with JavaScript, I have to switch
to
to
know,
node.
yes.
Okay. Can I ask what's node abbreviation for, the NODE?
Ooh, you can ask it, but I'm not gonna lie to you. I do not know that off the top of my head. So I
It
will
is ac-
search that up and get back to you.
It's okay.
it is actually not an
Thank you.
abbreviation. Though most things are an abbreviation, so you're thinking the right way, Murad. Node is called Node because for reasons not worth going into, JavaScript is kind of good at being like the node or the hub for like lots of messages, like a little real-time chat server, sort of a classic thing you would build with Node.js. And so the name comes from that idea, which is not very intuitive, to be honest.
All right.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Francis.
Of course. All right. So that's pretty much where as in depth as we're going to go with Node today. The next thing that we're going to start covering is going to be our actual types, the different data types that we can interpret with JavaScript. So in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to be utilizing the type of function. Now the type of function, and actually I'm jumping the gun here. Let me go ahead and go into a couple of different things here that I would like us to pay attention to. Okay, got it. So the first one is going to be extensions. Currently, you can see my JavaScript. You can see I have a couple. I have a ridiculous amount of extensions. Apparently, I didn't realize that until now. But I need to manage my extensions a little better. But when it comes to JavaScript, there's one extension that's almost vital to being able to write clean JavaScript code. And that's going to be prettier here. So prettier code formatter. And I wonder if I could copy the link maybe. I likely can't, but if you go into your extensions, click here on the search bar and type in prettier. When prettier shows up, you can click on it and install this into your JavaScript and into your VS Code as a file extension. Now, what prettier does is it actually manages my syntax within my JavaScript script, and it starts giving me a little bit of better hints as to what it is that I'm possibly doing wrong regarding my syntax. Now, I see a question here from Brandon. Go ahead.
It was actually just something I wanted to add, because you mentioned that you had so many extensions. At the bottom left, there is a like little avatar. If you end up having a lot of extensions, I strongly recommend signing in and synchronizing your account, because that means on any computer you could log into your VS Code and have all your extensions. So it allows you to be a little bit more mobile. And it's super, super useful.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you for adding that, Brandon. All right. So now that we have my extension set in, I have this console.log statement. Well, console.log is a JavaScript function, which is going to log something to my console, all right? And this console portion here, we can see that it's a little bit flexible, right? So it tells us what kind of data type it is. If I hover over it, it tells me, hey, this is a variable named console, and it typically references the console class. Well, why would it do something like that? That's because your console is very dependent on what is executing this code. So console means wherever this code is being executed. If I execute this code inside of my terminal, it's going to take that as the console and log it. If I go into my web page, I can see that in my developer tools, I also have an option for console. And just like in my JavaScript, or just like in Visual Studio Code, I can go ahead and do console.log hello. And that will also log into the console hello. All right, so there we go. Everything's working well. I understand what console is. And this logging function is quite literally just logging what's in between the parentheses onto the console. It is not returning something because we can see that it says undefined. And we'll go into the difference between returning and logging into the console here shortly as well. So now this type of function returns something, right? So type of doesn't log anything into the console. It actually just tells me what data type is it that I'm messing with. So this is a string. And currently, if I execute example.js, nothing is logged into my console. So the type of function or operator, whatever you want to call it, is grabbing this as an argument. It's analyzing what kind of data type it is, and it's returning a value. The value that it's returning is string, and maybe this is a little confusing. I should put this should be a string type, right? The value that it would be returning is a string. But just because it's returning it onto the script doesn't mean it's going to be logged into my console. So if I want to log it into my console, I have to specifically tell JavaScript, I want you to grab my console and I want you to log the following into my console. So this function is happening, and within it, the type of operator or function is going to go ahead and take a look at what's in between the parentheses, which is my argument. It's going to say, hey, this here is a string. It's going to return that to the log and log it onto my console. So now when I execute it, I can see that string gets logged into the terminal. Does anyone have any questions over these two different operators here? Go ahead, Connor.
I would actually like to add something to this console log discussion. So you can do a regular console.log and it'll like put regular text onto the console. You can also do console.error and it will like log your errors. And if you're in the web browser tools, it will be red. And then if you do console.warning, it will be yellow, as you can see down there already in his web browser.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. All right. We'll go into demonstrating all of that once we get into our actual web development portion. But for now, the important function that I want to make sure we cover is this logging statement. And we'll be covering why here shortly. All right, so back to our variables here, or excuse me, our data types. We can see we have a couple. Currently, I'm copying and pasting what I have here. And I want to demonstrate a couple of differences for a string here. So this is a string. It just has a slight disadvantage. We'll be covering what that disadvantage is here shortly. And then finally, we have a third type of string. All right. So currently, because I have that prettier extension, when I hit Command S to manually save this file, Prettier takes a look at the file and it formats it for me. You can see that now there's spaces in between my code. The parentheses after type of are now gone. You can see there's a semicolon there at the end. That all got cleaned up by Prettier and not me myself, right? It's cleaning up my JavaScript syntax to make it look nice and quite literally prettier. Now, if I run this example.js, we're going to see that all three of these different types of formats are string. It just changed one of them into double quotes. So I'm going to change that back to single quotes. And if I execute the same code, we'll still see that all three of them are a string. Now, here's the main difference between them, right? Let's say I have a string, just like these two, and I want to type in a word that takes in an apostrophe, such as isn't. Well, when I type in isn't into this specific string, or wow, I can't spell, apparently. There you go. Everything works perfectly fine. But if I type in isn't into the string below, when I try to include my apostrophe, I start getting an error. Why do we think that's happening?
Same simple.
Because it's start, and I think we have to make like the beginning and the end two quotation to be like this is the whole string. Because it will take the string, right? Yeah, exactly.
You have
like
to
how we
escape
did.
the character.
Right, I would have to escape the character if I wanted to do so. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is I have my starting of my string, and here's where my string ends. And then on the furthest right-hand side, I'm essentially starting a brand new string. But this letter T is now expected to be a variable. Now, there's a couple of ways to work around this. Just like Kyle said, I could escape the character, right? If I put a backslash there, then it would escape the following character, allowing that string to be executed correctly. Now, it's definitely user preference. You could escape the character, or you could just utilize double quotes. I strongly recommend that you just utilize double quotes for the majority of your strings, unless they are going to be interpolated strings. Now, interpolated strings is our third type of string down here below. Again, if I go to console.log all of these say that they are string. But something really cool that I can do here is rather than just writing string, I can use this money sign and arrow brackets to type in JavaScript code. And what do I mean by that? Well, in JavaScript, I can run mathematical operations such as addition. So I'm just going to add this 4 plus 4 and then have it and then have it run here. So we see that everything works fine. Everything is still string, but now let's look at the content of our strings and how they display. All right. I run my node example. So here we see the first one. This should be a string type, and then the isn't at the very end. The escape character doesn't show up in my log onto my console. All right. So there is no escape character in my log. It just escapes, does its functionality, but it gets ignored when it's actually being executed and logged onto my console. And then finally, my string interpolation. Well, we know 8 is what the result of 4 plus 4, but it gets added straight into the string. Now, why is that unique? All right, well, what happens if I do something like this? I do 8 plus the following. Well, if I do 8 plus the following, we can see that it worked. It just didn't work exactly how I wanted it to. All right, now I have to not only consider the 8, but I also have to consider the space in between them. And I have to add it manually this way. All right, so this also works. And I could do my 4 plus 4 operator and then add this information. But as you'll learn in JavaScript, interacting with string and numbers is not always going to be this simple. And the majority of the time, you'll be better off utilizing string interpolation to interact any of your JavaScript code with your string.
Can you inside the interpolation, inside the squirrely brackets, can you like put function calls and just like whatever you want, or is it one statement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So inside of my string interpolation here, I can write all JavaScript in there. As long as the ending of that function continues to return something, or there is something that's going to be returned by that method, function, or operator, then I can still put it within my curly brackets. If it doesn't return something, then what I'll get is undefined showing up within my string. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right. Awesome. So that's it for string so far. Let's go ahead and move on to our next portion here. We've covered strings. Let's talk about numbers and floats. All right. So again, I'm going to go ahead and log this into my console. For those of you that are familiar with JavaScript, with Python, you'll know that floats and numbers are handled differently. Well, in JavaScript, that is not the case. All right, so here you can see I'm console.logging the number 1, and I'm asking what type is it. And in the one below, I'm going to be logging onto the console the type of 2.5565. Now, this is typically known as a decimal. Now that we're programmers, we're going to go ahead and call these numbers floats from now on. These are float numbers, and they essentially represent anything that has a decimal within them. And then we have our solid numbers, which as programmers, we expect that to be a number. Now, in other languages, these two data types have specific functions to one another and they work differently. But here in JavaScript, that's not the case. In JavaScript, when we go ahead and get our type of these two, we can see that they are both just number types. They operate almost exactly the same. I can still grab these two and do addition to one another. Whereas in other stricter programming languages, that wouldn't work. Other languages may tell me, hey, you can't add an integer to a float. But in this case, in JS, it's going to allow that to happen naturally without any problem. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding integers and floats? Oh, excuse me, regarding numbers and floats?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, Dan.
So the console dot log type of returns the data type of whatever is being asked, but the console dot log parentheses the numbers returns the value, correct? Or are they completely the same like name?
So console.log is always going to return, it's always going to log whatever is within the parentheses onto the console. The difference is that when I'm asking type of is essentially a function that's being executed inside of console.log. It evaluates if this is what data type it is, and that's what gets logged onto the console. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yeah, so type of just returns the data type, but using regular console.log returns the value, correct?
Exactly. Doesn't
Okay.
return the value, but logs it into the console.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so there we can see when I did the addition operator there, the type of returned the number, and then this plus 2.56, it essentially added the string of number to 2.56. That's just JavaScript craziness being crazy. All right. So far we covered our numbers. We've covered a little bit about string. Let's talk about our ability to mutate this string and what we can do with string right up above, right? And actually, before we start going into that, I want to go into Booleans. So let's start with our Booleans next. So now, just like everything, or almost every programming language, we need to know whether something is truthy or falsy, right? It's our 0 and 1, the most basic functionality that we need to actually work with. Well, these are called Boolean variables. And just as we previously mentioned, there's only 2 of them. We can console.log type of Boolean of true or Boolean of false. And both of these will return Boolean. We'll go into how we could evaluate some of these other data types into Booleans. But for now, let's keep it nice and simple. It's just true or false. It doesn't get any more simpler than that. All right, if we go ahead and run our console.log down below, we can see we get true and false. All right, now let's start with the manipulation process. So here I have a string, and I want to be able to manipulate it. I'm going to go ahead and start storing these strings into different types here, or sorry, into different variables, so I can start working with them. And what a variable is essentially just a place for me to store something. Like I mentioned before, everything is just boxes inside of boxes, right? Every time I create a variable or every time I start a data type is a box in itself. And when I put it inside of a variable, I'm just putting it inside of a box that I'm labeling, right? So let me create my first box here. I'm going to say let my greeting equal hello X-ray. All right. What is going on with this variable here? Let my greeting. So we'll learn in JavaScript, there's a couple of different ways to establish a variable. Let allows me to change the value of my greeting. Whereas if I were to use something like const, when I say goodbye whiskey, or sorry, goodbye X-ray, switching cohorts, const wouldn't allow me to switch the value of farewell. So now let's put that into practice here. Let's go ahead and say my greeting is equal to no. I'm going to go ahead and console.log my greeting. And then I'm going to do the same down below. All right, so here's my greeting. It's hello X-ray. I am then going to log it onto my console. I should see hello X-ray displaying on my console. I'm going to change its value to no, and then I'm going to log it onto my console one more time, which should result with me seeing no in my console. All right, I was able to change its value. And that's because I put let. Well, now let's try to do this with our farewell statement. Now I'm going to start demonstrating some keyboard shortcuts here. I'm utilizing Command D to repeat or highlight all the instances that I've coded in before. This is for Mac users. If you're a Windows user, I believe it's Control D, but I may be wrong. All right. So I'm going to change it now for farewell. And when I execute this script, I get an error. So let's take a look at our error here. My first log onto my console of farewell says goodbye X-ray. And here's where I start getting my error. And look at that. JavaScript is friendly enough to actually tell me exactly where it is that I'm making my error. It's giving me the path to the file. Not only does it give me the path to the file, but then it tells me, hey, on line 10, this is where this mistake is originating from. So there I see farewell equals no. This equal sign or this equal operator is saying that I'm trying to assign a value to farewell. Well, I already had assigned a value to farewell. So where's the issue coming from? Well, it's telling me assignment to a constant variable. All right. So that doesn't really tell me too much. But essentially what the error is that I am trying to give farewell a new value, even though it already had one. Now, if I had a mutable data structure in there, that's fine. I could probably mutate that data structure without changing the value of farewell. But because strings are immutable, I can't just alternate it or just assign a completely new value altogether. All right, does anyone have any questions about these two variable types? We have let and const and how to establish variables.
Yeah, do we have any other kind of variable or just those two variables, the let and const?
Yeah, it's a great question. We do have one more. It's named var. We're not going to go into it because it's not typically used and it is not good practice to utilize var anymore. Please try to utilize only let and const moving forward. Does that answer your question, Murad?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Of course. All right. Well, let's continue moving on with strings now. We have my greeting with hello X-ray. What if I wanted to change some of the values of hello X-ray, right? For example, let's say I just wanted to have a simple exclamation mark at the very end of it, or I could add something to the end of it. Let me see here. I'm trying to think about how to demonstrate mutability as much as possible. All right, let's do this. So we have my greeting, hello X-ray, and this is a string. It is an iterable data structure. Now, what that means is that a string essentially works as a line of boxes, each one of them representing the index. And what I mean by index is we could have 1, 2, 3, and I did that wrong. I apologize. So this should be, we always start counting from 0. So this will be 0, 1. There you go. 0, 1, 2, and 3. Right, starting from the very left side with 0 and moving on forward. So with that said, I can grab a specific portion of my string and log it onto my console. So I can say console.log. You can say my greeting index 1. Now my greeting at index 1, what do we think that's going to log onto the console?
The E.
Yeah, it's just going to load. It's just going to log the letter E onto my console. All right. Well, that's great. And now let's say that I wanted to change this hello here into a lowercase letter. Well, you would think that I could just do something like assigning it into a first letter, right? I can say, well, I'm going to grab the very first index, which is 0. I'm grabbing that letter H. And rather than having it be a capital letter, I want it to be a lowercase letter. Well, now when I console log my greeting, I wonder what it is that I'm going to see. Well, I go ahead and try to make this log onto my console, and it works. There's no error. It doesn't throw an error, doesn't say, hey, you did something wrong, or this isn't okay to do. It just simply ignores my command. It says, oh, you're trying to do variable reassignment to a string. Can't do that. Sorry. Doesn't give me any sort of message, anything like that. It just keeps executing code. But when I do this console log statement, I can see that it was ignored and there was never a reassignment to that first index of my letter. All right, so that's what I mean by immutable. So strings and so there's mutable and immutable. And just for a funny story as to why I had trouble understanding this concept, I used to relate the word mutable to like the mute button on a TV. All right, which is it's not at all what it's aimed to. So mutable instead is like mute excuse my nerdiness, but I think of it now as kind of like a mutant, right? Or someone that's able to mutate something. So a mutable variable is something that can change, mutate into something, whereas an immutable variable is something that will not change regardless of the conditions that you're trying to pass on to it. You can do reassignment, but you cannot change the data structure itself. Does anyone have any questions over this topic so far?
Yeah, you said it didn't give error when you try to reassign or to change the immutable variable?
That's correct. It's not going to give you an error. It's just simply going to ignore it.
I think that would make a big problem if we're writing code and
Yes.
it didn't, right? Yeah, that's a big problem. Because when you use Python, it immediately give you error.
Yeah.
So you can catch it. But here, if you're writing big code, that would mean, yeah.
Yes. So as you progress in your programming career, or at least in my preference, I've realized that I like angrier languages more than I like languages that just let me do whatever I want. Because languages that let me do whatever I want usually end up with a lot of errors, whereas languages that are extremely angry and don't let me do anything that I actually
Yeah.
do,
Right, yeah.
keep me.
Okay, the question is there any way to avoid this? Or is there anything can take my attention when I'm writing the code? There's something wrong here? Or I just have to be careful
Yeah, that's a
with
great
JavaScript?
question. Unfortunately, the answer is the latter. You just have to be careful.
That's it.
Yes.
Is there any technique when I'm working to avoid this?
Oh, all right. So when it comes to techniques, I would say, especially when you're first starting off, log on to the console like crazy. If you're making any sort of mutation or you're expecting any sort of behavior, double check and triple check that that behavior is actually happening. Don't just assume that you're writing the correct syntax. It never takes that long to go back and remove console.log statements. So if you end up writing 100 console.logs in one script, perfectly fine, as long as you're getting to the result that you want. Just make sure you go back and clean it up and remove them. Does that answer your
So
question?
so you mean that when I'm writing code in JavaScript, I have to always test each line I write, right? That's what you mean?
Right. Not each
With
individual line necessarily, but each individual step.
yeah, I mean each individual step.
Yes.
Yeah, don't wait to the end and then you don't know where the problem,
Exactly.
right? Okay. Thank you very much.
Of course. And I see, Gary, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, so if you're using like a JavaScript program, like I know there's different ones that you can, use the code on. Like, um, is there not like there's not like a built-in function that to check or show you in real time what you're creating, like in your experience? Like, I don't know if that's a thing or what applications you guys use for that, but
Yeah, that's a great question. So here we're going to be utilizing the React framework, and it's going to be utilizing JavaScript. That's its main front end language. So you'll be able to see pretty much in real time anything that you're trying to update, but it doesn't give you an explanation as to why something is or isn't working. So as you'll progress in the cohort, you'll come to love errors, because the worst feeling is when you don't have an error, but you're still not getting the result that you want, right? That's the worst scenario there, because then you have no idea where things went wrong. So the more errors you get, the better, because an error can at least tell me, hey, you did something wrong around this area. Does that answer your question, Gary?
it does. Thank you.
Of course. All right, everyone, we've been going on for quite a bit. It's currently 10 o'clock. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 10:10 to continue on with our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, everyone. So before we left, we started talking about mutability when it comes to strings. Now, there's a very key difference here between changing a variable's value and mutating the actual string itself, right? So for example, let's say I wanted hello X-ray to show up with all lowercase letters. And I tried doing that by saying my greeting index 6, which should be the X, is equal to a lowercase x. Right, and then I try to execute this command. Well, if I execute that command, we're gonna see that hello x-ray still comes out to be all uppercase, to have uppercase letters within them, right? Well, there's a couple of methods, and we're not gonna knock into methods because that would take just way too long if we talked about every single method in JavaScript. But let's say that I wanted to have this all be lowercase. Well, I wonder if I do console.log mygreeting.to lowercase, and then I go ahead and send that information. Well, now it all turns into lowercase. The value of, or the actual content of my variable mygreeting is still uppercase, right? If I go to execute that, we can see that this specific function returns a value, right? But it doesn't change or mutate the original value of data type. It's still hello x-ray. Now there's something called variable reassignment. Because I utilize let, I can say my greeting is equal to my greeting.to lowercase. And what I'm saying there is I'm essentially saying, all right, well, I already have this variable named my greeting, and it has some content inside of it. But I want to change that content to be all lowercase letters. I can't mutate the string. So I have to make an entire new string and assign it to the same variable. So I'm utilizing the original value, which is hello x-ray with uppercase letters. I'm triggering a method named toLowercase, which returns the same string in lowercase, and then I'm assigning it to my greeting. All right, so again, this is called variable reassignment. I am not mutating the actual string. The string is still immutable. I'm just changing the value that's within my variable to get it in all lowercase. Does anyone have any questions about the difference between variable reassignment and the mutation of a specific data type? Okay, awesome. I know this is the groundwork, everyone, but it's important for us to get the fundamentals. So let's move on to the next portion here. We've talked about string for quite a bit. So now let's talk about what can we do with numbers. Well, numbers are a little bit different. They are not iterable data structures. They just exist as one specific element. All right, so here's a demonstration of what a string looks like. And here's a demonstration of what a number looks like. All right, so regardless of how many integers or how many numbers I'm placing within a specific number, let my num be equal to, I can't access my num through its index, all right, because it's not iterable. So if I say console.log my num index, I don't know, 3, which should be the very last one, it's not going to work. It's actually going to tell me, hey, this is undefined. I don't know what it is that you're trying to do there. Well, that's because this doesn't work the same way as a string does. It is not an iterable data structure. I can't do a for loop over 1, 2, and 3, and 4 unless I turn it into a string. So instead, numbers have other functionalities, and we're going to cover the two main ones, which is going to be pal, and I believe the other one than pal is going to be floor. So let's say my number is equal to 3. And instead, I want my number to be multiplied a specific number of times. And let me just make sure I have this syntax correctly here.
It's math.pal.
There you go. Thank you. Math. Notice I don't have to import math or anything. That's just regular to JavaScript, right? I'm going to go ahead and utilize that pal functionality. And I can call my variable of my number and make that be multiplied times something. And it's not multiplied, I apologize. This is the same thing as is it squaring? I think it's squaring, right? So I'm saying my number to the second power. I could do my number to the third power or to the fourth power. Obviously to the third, that should give me, I believe it's 27. I may be totally wrong there. Yep, 27. If I make it to the fourth power, I'm not gonna try to do that off the top of my head, but I think it's somewhere around the low 100s. Nope, not even close. All right, 81. So we can see how that iterates and how that POW function can come in nice and handy. Now, if I was trying to do something like floor, let's say I have 3 and 3 is equal to 100. And I want to divide my num, and I'm going to divide it by something like 13. Well, when I run this example, I get a number, but it's not necessarily something that I can actually want, right? It's not a solid number. So maybe that's not actually what I'm looking for. If I want a solid number, I can utilize math.floor. And we'll see what happens to the 7.69, right? Let's execute that. So it doesn't round it, right? Because if it was to just round, we would have got back an 8. Well, since I utilize floor, it's going to go down to its nearest solid number. So in this case, it was 7. If I wanted the opposite effect, instead of floor, we have seal, which is like sealing. All right. And rather than giving me 7, it's giving me 8 because now it's rounding up to its nearest solid number. Does anyone have questions over those different mathematical operators?
So is it best to use seal to get its nearest number? Well, if it was 7.4, would it go to 7 or would it go to 8 for math.seal?
Yeah, if it was 7.4 and I utilized math.seal, it would go to 8 because it's always going to go up. It's not actually doing rounding. It's just either going all the way up to the top or all the way down to the bottom. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but is there a function for rounding?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. Let's check it out.
It's round.
All right. Thank you. Whoever that was. All right. So if I utilize actually round, it's still going to actually round for me. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes, so would that just be better to use that than floor or seal?
Well, that's all situation dependent, right? What is it that you're trying to achieve? All right. So for example, if I'm doing some sort of accountability for groups, right? Take for example, the Zoom rooms, right? What I want there to be a minimum or a maximum. Right? Let's say we have an odd number of students and I'm trying to break up Zoom rooms. Well, I know that eventually I'm going to want one room to have 3 people within them. So I would have to utilize something like math.floor to ensure that whatever is left over just gets added to that room. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Of course. Tim?
So yeah, my question is like, for example, you got the number, like you said, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you wanted to do each individual number in multiplications. Can you use the same thing in like Python as like I+1, or how does that work? Like, for the length of the integer or whatever.
Are you talking about like the range function within Python?
Yeah, I guess so. Like, yeah. So for range in blah, 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 I want to find each individual multiplication of each number, for example. Is an I+1 a thing that you can use in JavaScript or not?
Got it. Okay. So you're talking about the +1 function specifically. So let's try it out here. So here I have my num +1, right? So that would work if I go ahead and run this. But I believe what you're referencing to is, so if I do my num +1, will that actually show up when I console.log my number?
So in Python, you use a for loop usually, you know, for this amount of times, I'm going to multiply these digits by etc. or whatever, using +1 for the ending. I was just curious if JavaScript worked the same kind of way.
Ah, okay. I get what you're talking about. And yes, it does. We're going to be going over that here shortly once we get to for loops later on in this lesson. All right.
So Tim, I would like to add on to that. So in JavaScript, we do for loops a little bit differently than we do it in Python. In Python, we use a range object, but in JavaScript, we do a different syntax, which I'm sure he will cover.
All right, go ahead, Murad.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to understand, what did he talk about? What did he mean by the function I+1?
We're going to be covering that here shortly. Just give me a second to get down to that portion of the lecture, and then we'll go ahead and actually explain it.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right. So far we've gone over our numbers, we've gone over our Boolean variables, and we've covered our string. But let's talk a little bit about our weird data structures. All right, so we have, or excuse me, data types. We have something called null, and we have something called undefined. Now, both of them kind of represent emptiness, but not to the same exact portion. So undefined represents, hey, there's a memory space allocated for content that's supposed to be here, or that you may want to put in here, or maybe not, but there's nothing in there currently. Whereas null is literally nothing, right? Null is, I don't exist. This is something that's false, and I'm just here to be here, but I want you to know that there is nothing here at all, right? So that's going to be the clear difference between those two. Another way to think about it, typically null is an intentionally used an intentionally used data type to demonstrate that there's nothing in there, while undefined is usually happens whenever you're not grabbing the return statement of some function or some operator the way that you intend to. All right, so that's going to be the key difference between those two. If I were to establish them, I could say let my variable be equal to, if I do that and I do console.log my variable, this should populate as undefined. So there we can see undefined populates. There's nothing there. The variable exists. There's a memory space allocated for this variable, but it just doesn't have anything in it. It's vague, right? It says, I don't know what I'm supposed to be holding. It's just empty without being empty. Whereas if I do null, and then I try to do it, it very explicitly tells me, hey, this is null. This doesn't exist. This is an empty variable. And you can even see that node gives me this like grayed out thing to point out vaguity. Like it's not 100% sure. Whereas null is, this is completely empty, doesn't exist. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, my question is, does it still leave a memory spot or save a memory spot basically to save my var variable, even though it is designed or as null right now? Like, is that subject to change? Like, there's still a memory slot for that specific variable?
Yes, there is a memory slot for this specific variable. Its content would just be null. Murad?
Yeah, you said null means it doesn't exist.
Right.
So the whole variable doesn't exist.
No, the variable itself, again, so the way everything's boxes within boxes, right? We're starting to talk about memory space, which I'm trying to avoid to a certain extent. When I create the variable exists, but the contents could either be string, numbers, etc., etc. If I do undefined, well, undefined shows up within that variable in this format. Whereas if I utilize null, null will show up within the variable, but it will show up as a solid, a known, rather than an unknown.
So both reserving memory, right?
The variable is preserving memory, not the data type.
In whatever it undefined or no.
Yes, is it,
So in both cases, null or undefined, the variable already reserved this memory. It take space.
the variable already takes space. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, but when it is which is null, I'm confused. I confused what the difference between null, because I feel like both exist now. Whatever the undefined, when it's undefined or when it's null, because the variable is already exist in the space, okay, of the memory, and in case of undefined, when you make in case of null, you said it's solid. I'm confused. I can't understand that.
Yeah, and that's definitely a good question. And this might be a good opportunity for us to go into our comparison statements and try to evaluate Truthy and Falsey statements. And it might enlighten us a little bit as far as null and undefined. So let's start.
Can I offer something real quick?
Oh, of course, Len.
So, I mean, we all know the analogy of a variable being a box, right? You know, and it's holding some content to it. And so when you first initialize it and you say, let my var, if you don't initialize it to a value or put anything in the box, JavaScript will automatically throw in the null. It just does. That's the way the people wrote it, right? They put a null in the box. Great. Awesome. If you put something in the box other than null, that'll be in the box. Does that make sense?
So you mean if I create variable, okay, and that variable is empty, that means it's no label.
Not
in the variable.
initialized. It isn't empty. It's got a null in it. It's not initialized.
What did you mean by not initialized?
You don't use the equal sign.
Ah, okay.
Don't say equal something other than null, right? Can you change that equal null there to like equal 1, please?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. He's now initializing my var to 1. When you first put something in the variable, it's called initializing the variable.
Okay.
Right? If you don't initialize a variable in JavaScript, JavaScript helps you out, in quotes, and throws a null in the box. It initializes it to null.
No, it doesn't. No,
Okay, so
it doesn't
undefined
initialize it to null. Like it's just gonna return undefined.
Yeah.
Null is an actual value.
Oh, sorry. Okay, that's my bad.
All right, I'm
Undefined.
so sorry, everyone, but I'm gonna have to stop this here before we start going down a rabbit
That's
hole.
fair.
I'm gonna go ahead and take over. We'll continue on with the lecture, and then we can discuss this later on. All right, so we have this variable here, all right? And we have let my var, and now we're gonna start talking about our comparison statements in Truthy and Falsey. So now, all I'm gonna do in a comparison statement is I'm gonna go ahead and write an if. So in this, sorry, not comparison, I apologize. These are called, where's my vocabulary?
Conditional?
Conditional statements. There you go. So now if I'm going into my conditional statements, I'm just going to write this if, and I'm going to say if this is true, well, what I want you to do is I want you to log on to my console. This is true. Well, when I run this, obviously we would see, hey, this is true. If I turn this back into my other Boolean here of false, and I were to run this information, nothing would happen. Again, Prettier and VS Code are already giving me a hand here. They're trying to block that out, showing me, hey, this isn't going to happen because you already defaulted this to false. So it doesn't matter what I do. Well, now let's start talking about our variables here. So let's say let my variable be equal to not an empty string. and I say if my var. Now, I'm not actually asking if my var is meeting some sort of condition, such as if its length is a certain number. I'm not asking if it does anything weird. I'm actually asking if this variable is holding something within it that has content, right? So when I execute this here, oh, hello, I pressed a bunch of keys at the same time. When I execute that there, I still get this is true. Well, I wonder what would happen if I take off the content of the string here. All right, so I take off the content of my string. I still have my var. Well, let's go ahead and execute that. That's weird. So now when I ran this here, it was able to execute my program perfectly fine, but I got a little bit of a different behavior where at first it was actually console.logging my string of this is true, and now it's not. So this is telling me that a string that is empty will be evaluated to falsy, and a string that contains content will actually be evaluated to a Truthy statement. All right, so there's our first one. The next one is going to be our numbers. So if I do 0 here for my variable, and I run this information, I'm going to receive false. 0, it's empty. My port is closed. True or false, right? This isn't working, and it's not actually giving me a good value. Well, if I put anything other than 0 within my numbers, I would expect it to come back truthy. Again, a floating number is still evaluated as a number. A solid number is still evaluated as a number. And what happens if I do a negative number? Well, a negative number is also truthy. So the only number that is falsy is 0. All right, so now I've gone over my truthy and falsy values for both string and numbers. Does anyone have any questions over those two? Okay, great.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Murad.
So what if we make it null?
Yeah, so let's move into that portion here. All right, so let my var here, and I'm going to go ahead and try to console.log my var. So I'm going to console log my var to see what it actually logs into the console, what's its current value. And then I'll go ahead and run my if statement. So Node, when it runs example.js, it's telling me, hey, this is undefined. There's no actual value inside of the variable, right? The variable exists in itself, but there's no content in it. Like somebody said earlier, it's not initialized, right? It's undefined. All right, great.
So that's equal 0, right?
Right, this would have equaled 0 as far as truthy and falsy statement. This comes back as false. Is that what you're asking, Murad?
What I'm asking, if we didn't define the variable, like here, when you didn't define it, my var, there is no equal sign and we put something inside it, it gives undefined, right? If you make it equal 0, it's gonna be the same response when it gives null here in this situation.
Yeah, so let's try null first, and then afterwards we'll talk about your secondary question that you're asking. So now if I run null, I'm actually going to receive pretty much the same exact behavior, right? Null is going to be logged into my console, and this if statement isn't being triggered. Now, again, here's the difference between them, right? So I have my variable, when it was holding undefined, it didn't have anything inside of it. Where when I have my variable on the right-hand side with something inside of it, but this something is specifically null, saying this is nothing, right? I'm explicitly stating that this is going to be empty, while this one is implicitly stating, I don't know what I am. I was never told what I'm supposed to be. There is a variable there, but I don't hold anything, nor have I been told what I'm supposed to be. It is undefined. It has no meaning. To get into dark jokes, its life has no meaning, right? It doesn't know what its purpose is in life. While the other one, it knows that its purpose in life is to do nothing. Does that answer your question?
That's great explanation, but it took me to another question. When shall I use null? When shall I assign null to the variable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's say we're working on some sort of user authentication page, right? Or to use it in our everyday concept, every time you go into Google Chrome, when you go into Google Chrome and you're signed in, it's automatically grabbing all of your information and it's already running all that, loading all your tabs, all your cookies and everything for you. Well, when there isn't a user logged in, there needs to be some sort of conditional statement to evaluate if there is a user or if there isn't. All right. If there is no user, I don't want that variable to just be undefined. I want to explicitly know there is no user. And that's where I would set it as null. Does that answer your question, Murad?
That's great answer.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Of course. All right. Hopefully that cleared up some of the confusion. I apologize, everyone. Let's go ahead and move on into the next portion of our lecture, which is going to be our actual comparison operators. All right. So far we've been looking at these variables. And let's actually start running some conditional statements with comparisons. Let's say this is a string. Well, I have my var there. Well, let's say I want this to only happen if my var dot length is greater than 5. Well, when I execute this, this tells me that the length of my string is actually longer than 5. All right. Now, there's a couple of other things that I can do to this string and a couple of other comparison operators, but comparison operators are pretty, pretty simple. They're essentially greater than, less than, or equal to. And then you have less than or equal or greater than or equal. So now I can say, well, what if I want to check that my variable is equal to a string? All right, its type is equal to a string. And I should probably run a type here. This might work. Let's see. All right. Oh, man. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole if I do that. Let's do this is a string. There you go. Right? If I run this, it's going to compare the left side. And because I'm utilizing a triple equal sign, it's going to check the exact value of it. Now, without getting into a huge rabbit hole here, there's a difference between triple equals and double equals. We will ask that for the duration of this cohort, you utilize triple equals unless you have a very specific reason why you need double equals. So now triple equals is strict, while double is loose, meaning that my string could be whatever I want, but they're both still strings. When I run this comparison, I was expecting that to evaluate to true, so I might have missed something here. Yep, I definitely missed something there. I apologize, Sharon. I'll have to come back to that. All right. So we're going to utilize triple equals for all of our actual comparisons here. I'm going to go back to my dot length function to demonstrate a little bit more of this greater than sign here. So I'm going to say I only want this to be triggered if it is greater than or equal to, and actually let me check how many there is. There's 16. So I'm going to go ahead, if it is, say that if it's greater or equal to 16, it should execute true. Again, if I make this any lower than 16. Oh, maybe I counted wrong. I likely counted wrong. Let's do that. I'm going down the wrong way. I apologize. So my var.length is equal to 16, right? So if, as long as that's greater than the number down below, if I were to turn this to 17, then my statement would fail, right? if I turned it into 16, it would work because I have that greater than or equal sign. And if I just turned it into greater than, well, then it would fail yet again because it is not equal to it as well. Does anyone have any questions over the comparison of the triple equal sign, greater than, or equals? Go ahead, Murad.
So when you make equal or greater than or equal or less than or equal, that mean you comparing value to value. And when you make it like the triple, you comparing the types. Is that what you mean?
So, I'm sorry. I think I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding your question. Could you say your question one more time, please?
Okay, you start with comparing with triple equal.
Okay.
Okay, is this triple equal comparing values or comparing the types?
Comparing content and types.
Comparing
Oh,
comparing.
Francisco, there's a good example that you could use. You could name one variable 1 and variable 2, and have one variable be a string and the other be a number, and do a triple equals, and it will return false.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so one is a number and the other is a string with the same number there. And if you do a triple equals on that, it will return false. But if you do a double equals, it will return true.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that was Mikhail. All right. So if I execute this here, you'll see that triple equals throws in false, right? It gets evaluated to false.
And another thing, in that if statement, you could just do an else and it will return something that says it's not equal. So just do an else.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. All right. So this part here is doing that triple equals, right? And it's doing a strict, meaning that it's checking both the type and content. They're not the same. Whereas if I were to use a double equals and I run this now, this comes back to be true. They're not the same type, but their content is the same. Does that answer your question, Murad? Of
Yes, thank you.
course. All right. So now let's go ahead and instead, let's expand on these conditional statements now. So as previously mentioned, there is if and there is else, right? My else statement does not take any sort of argument within it. I can still do console.log and say this is false. Now, if I were to run this into a triple equals and I run this information, everything works great. Well, now let's go ahead and take this a step further and go into my else if. And I think it's elif. Nope, else if. Right? So here, an else if statement is going to say, well, if the first statement isn't true, we can trigger whatever is in this second statement if that is true. So let's go back to my var, and let's say my var.length is greater than, and let's go ahead and say that it is greater than 3. All right. Now let's say my var.length is less than, or actually it's equal to 3. And let's say console.log, this is from the else if. All right. So obviously my var is only 3 characters long. So my first one is going to fail. And when I run this operation, we can see that I get this is from the else if, because the first statement came in false. It checked the secondary condition. And since that was evaluated to true, it executed this block of code and then ignored the else statement. Now, let's say that my first if statement did evaluate to true. Right, so my var.length is less than 4, but my var.length is also equal to 3. Well, the first conditional statement is going to be the block of code that gets executed, while the remaining else if or else blocks will remain being ignored. Does anyone have any questions regarding if, else if, and else?
So for the comparison, we use the triple equal, right?
Yes, moving on forward, we ask everybody to use the triple equals.
Comparison of values
Values and types.
and types. So it should be the same type and the same value.
Yes.
Okay. And double equal, it just take the value, whatever the type.
Exactly. Double equal would concentrate on values.
Okay, that's it. Thank you. So double equal, that's like math. Just math.
Like what? I'm sorry?
Just math, mathematics.
No, not necessarily.
I think double equals is a lot of times used for like user input, so they could type a 3 or it could come in as a string, so you want to verify either way.
Are we talking about when to use double equals in JavaScript?
I believe
Yes.
so, but
Never?
I've spent a little bit too much time on that.
Yeah.
We can go ahead and talk about that afterwards or in between breaks. But I have to continue moving on. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to cover the rest of the lecture.
I agree, and there's a very simple answer to that question, which is never, and we'd be happy to talk with people more about why that is later.
All right. So now we've talked a little bit about our conditional statements. We talked a little bit about all of our data types, Truthy and Falsey, but let's go into our more complex data structures now, or data types. I apologize. All right. The next data type that we're going to be covering is going to be arrays. So I'm going to go ahead and make an array here of my array of days. And actually, this is the first time I'm going to be covering the naming convention since I'm using more than one word. You'll notice that in Python, you do something called snake casing. So this would look something like array of days in Python. Well, in JavaScript, you're going to try to utilize camel cases. Right, so here's our camel case. I have my array of days. I'm going to go ahead and go and build my days here. So I have my Monday. I have my Tuesday. Wednesday. Thursday. And so on. All right, I'm not going to go through each individual one of them, but arrays work pretty similar to strings. They kind of replicate the same structure here. But they're able to hold pretty much any type necessary. Oh, hello. And here's what I mean by that. All right, so here's my array. And let me move it a little bit further away. So here's my array. My array can hold different data types inside each one of its slots, but it is still iterable. So let's say I have a string inside of my first slot. Well, my string would fall within the first slot just as such. Whereas if I had a number inside of my second slot, it would fall just like this. And I could even have other arrays inside of an array. So I could have arrays inside of arrays. An array can hold any sort of data type inside of it, and it just occupies one specific slot for it. So with that said, let's say I wanted to grab Monday out of this array of days. How could I log Monday into my console?
Array of days, square brackets, 0.
All right, I have my array of days, square bracket 0. I'm going to go ahead and run node example.js. And sure enough, there I get Monday. All right, so I was able to grab my array of days, square bracket 0. Now, what if I wanted to grab this A out of my array of days? How could I do that?
Would you do like 0 and then you put another index of 5? No, 4?
Yeah, let's try that. Let's do index of 4. And let's do that, and there we get the A. So what's exactly going on here, right? We have our array of days, and I'm saying to grab index 0. Well, I grab index 0, and after I grab index 0, I'm then telling it, hey, I know inside of index 0, I also have another iterable data structure. I want you to grab index 4, which unfortunately in this image, I don't have it. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we grabbed index 3. And that's what ends up being returned into our console in the log. All right, and that's how you iterate through arrays. Does anyone have any questions about how to grab specific elements out of arrays?
I got a question. So I see these are strings in these array. What about numbers? Like if you want to pull a 2 out of 123, would this work?
So when it comes to numbers, remember numbers themselves are not iterable structures, right? So notice that I have two different ones here, right? I have the actual number 123, and then I have 123. And let's do this in two separate console.log statements. And let's do array of days, and that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 4. And then finally, we have 5. All right, so if I were to execute this, we can see that I have a number of 123, and then I have a string of 123. All right, great. A number is not iterable. A string is. So if I were to want to grab the number 2, I could just simply say 1. And that would return the number 2. Well, if I do that for the one that is a number, it wouldn't work. All right, it would return undefined. So in order for this to happen effectively, I would have to turn it into a string and then grab index. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, so for that, just to like, I guess, follow up on it, it's just like, can you, sorry, how am I gonna place this? It's just, let me come back to you. I just lost the tip of my tongue. I'll get back to you.
All right, no problem at all. All right. So now, array of days, we just covered how to grab something out of an array. But now let's talk about mutating it, right? An array is a mutable data type, meaning that we can change the contents of the contents within it. Well, just like I could grab an index out of array of days, well, let's say I want to log onto my console, my array of days here, and what I want to grab is that 5th element there. Well, what would happen? I'm going to run it. We see that I get string of 123. So here's my 5th element. Well, I know the 5th day is actually, it would have to be Saturday in this case, right? Monday, Tuesday. Yeah. So it would be the 6th day, start counting from 0. I know, I apologize. So we're going to go ahead and grab the 6th day, and I'm going to assign this to Saturday. And then again, I'm going to console.log my array of days all together. So the first time it comes out at the string of 1, 2, and 3. But then I change the index of 5 of this array because it is a mutable data type. And I change it into Saturday here on line 44, which allows me to console.log that entire array of days into the correct order. All right. Mutable meaning it allows me to change its content. Now, let's say that I wanted to add something at the very end of the array. Well, this is where my push function would come in. I'm going to go ahead and say array of days. And actually, I'm going to switch these two. And I'm going to say dot push. I'm going to push in Sunday. And it looks like JavaScript is trying to give me a hint here that says, well, all right, you want to push Sunday. And it looks like it gives me an option of a number. So I'm likely able to pass in the index as to where it is that I want to push it. But if I leave it empty, it will automatically push it towards the end. All right, so there it is. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The only day missing now is Friday. And then we have Saturday. And I push into the array Sunday. Mutable, as in I'm able to extend, change its original values or contents, or even shorten up the array utilizing other array methods. Does anyone have any questions regarding arrays? All right. Doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's move on into our objects. So now objects are another form of box, but the way that I like to think about it is not as a box, but as a massive like storage system, or maybe like a mailbox place, right? For those of you who, I'm sure everybody has had experience with apartment complexes, or going to the post office and you see like the massive stack of different PO boxes, right? Well, each one of those boxes have one specific key, and you utilize that key to open up the box and grab the contents out of it. Well, that's the way that a object works. So let's say I have an employee here, all right? And my employee has all of its contents here. Maybe I have its name. Its name could be, let's go with Francisco, why not? Maybe I have their age. Their age could be 12. Maybe we also have something like, I'm running out of ideas here. Let's say shoes, and let's set that as null. So I'm a 12-year-old that goes to work without any shoes. And then let's see what else.
Profession, like profession.
Proficient?
Yeah.
Or profession. Got it. So then I could have profession, and I didn't put a comma up above, so it was throwing me an error. And maybe for my profession, I could have eating. Why not? Let's do that. All right. Classic 1900s America. Yeah. All right. So there you go. So now we have a object that's supposed to represent a specific employee with their name, age, shoes, and profession. All right. Well, a couple of key things to notice about this structure whenever I went ahead and built it. I utilized const. You could still utilize let. All right. I typically utilize const for objects because objects are not something that you want to overwrite the entire variable for. You want that variable to keep existing unless you're switching it between null and the existing object. But what you do change are the contents of said object, right? So the contents of this object can change. Well, how do I do that? I can actually access each one of these values. And again, these are key value pairs. So let me offer that insight here. I have my key, which is how I open my mailbox in order to get my value, right? So all of these are different boxes. They're all stored inside one massive like drawer container. All right, so let's say this is a massive drawer container. Oh, hello. But inside of this massive drawer container, I have a couple of separate values. They're not in any specific order per se. And the reason why I say they're not in any specific order is because objects are special in the fact that they grant us direct access. We don't have to iterate through things to be able to grab something every single time. I can just come straight to it with the correct key, And rather than having to go from top to bottom, I can just go to the correct box. Let's say it's this one per se, and open it to grab all of my contents. So now when I go to grab the profession of my employee, I can say log on to my console, my employees dot profession. And when I run this, it immediately returns eating. All right, this whole entire container with different drawers is my employee container. All right. And these 4 different drawers inside of it are locked. Well, I came with it with the correct key, which in this case it's profession. So I was able to open up my drawer and immediately grab the value of eating. All right. That's how you grab values out of a object. Well, what if I wanted to set a new value to an object? Well, let's say employee profession is now, I don't know, let's put running, why not? All right, I'm making it equal to running in this case. Well, if I run it again, now we can see that my employee profession is running. All right, now, why are these complex data types? Well, these are complex data types because they can become really nested. And a perfect example of how they become really nested, or why it's important to know how to interact with these things, is going to be later on when we start working with APIs. We're going to see that all of the information that gets exchanged over the web comes back in either a massive object or a massive array. And let's actually take a look at the Pokey API here, which we'll get really accustomed to and see its information or its contents. All right, I'm going to actually view it as raw JSON. So this API, when you can send requests to this API to grab information of specific Pokemon. So in this case, let's say that I wanted to grab information regarding Charizard. As you can tell, I use this API quite a bit. All right, so when I send this request to grab stuff from Charizard, well, it sends me all of Charizard's information as a massive object. This object then has keys inside of it, but this key has an array, and this array has objects inside each individual array. So at this point, my object is looking something like this. So I start with my object, I have my key, then my key has an array, and then my array then has objects of other objects of other objects, and so on. Why are you throwing an error? All right. And that continues down. It can all get really nested within one another, and it becomes a little bit difficult to actually manipulate this data. And that's why it's important to know how to actually interact with both objects and arrays. Does anyone have any questions about objects and arrays? I'm seeing stuff on the chat. Go ahead and take a look here. Oh, I see a question from Tim. Go ahead.
Oh, what's your favorite Pokemon?
My favorite Pokemon? So I mainly play like Fire Red and Leaf Green because I'm old school like that. And in there, I would have to say probably between Tyranitar and Dragon.
Ooh, big boys. Just curious. Figured I'd throw that out there.
Of course.
A very late game Pokemon.
So I see a couple of things here on the chat. Unfortunately, I'm not able to grab the actual question. I'm not trying to go that far back in the chat. But there is one more thing to objects that I would like to add. These keys here, even though I wrote them in string, I did that out of habit from Python. You don't necessarily have to write them in string. So I could have this profession here on the left-hand side and not put it in string, and it still doesn't throw an error. And you'll notice that if I go to console.log employee.profession, it still works perfectly fine. Well, it's grabbing these, and whether I put them in string or not, it's creating those keys. right? So at that point, it's just a syntactical sugar. It's your preference. You could either put them within quotation marks or you could not. I always put them within quotation marks just because I know that in Python, I have to put them within quotation marks. So consistency is just key for me. All right, we've been going on for quite a bit. It's already 11:06. Let's go ahead and take a 9-minute break and come back at 11:15 to continue on with our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll see everybody here in a bit. All right, this is going to be our final push all the way to complete our intro to JavaScript lecture. So let's go ahead and finish cleaning up this object lecture here. So this object, somebody asked me a really good question about how I can make a new key inside of an object, which I totally did not cover. So if I wanted to make a new key, I'm simply going to call the object itself. I'm going to utilize the employee object. And within square brackets, kind of like as if it was an index, I'm going to add what the new key will be. So I will say, hey, I want to add a new key, and then I will assign it a value, saying I am now a new key. Well, now if we go ahead and run this, we can see that new key is now officially part of my object. And if I wanted to remove this part, we would have to utilize the delete function and call the employee new key. Then again, I'm gonna copy and paste that. And when I run this, well, now we can see that we still have our original object with all of its original content, but we have just deleted new key. Our first log had new key added into it, and then we delete new key from our object. All right. Any questions regarding objects?
I got a question.
Sir.
So what if you wanted to add the new key at the top instead of add it automatically at the bottom? What if that would be, yeah, how do you position keys within a object?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And there's not a simple way of doing that. You can't just necessarily specify where is it that you want to insert the key. Especially since objects grant you direct access, right? Its assumption would be that you wouldn't need it to fall in a specific manner. But you can build a function that will go through the entire process of organizing it the way you want it to, and then build an object in the correct order that you would like it to be built. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. And then I think, Connor, would you like to add something?
I'd like to add on to that. So in JavaScript, objects don't have like an inherent ordering like lists do. Like a list, or they have a defined order like 0, 1, 2, 3, X, Y, and Z. But objects don't necessarily have that. So if you console log an object, you might get it in one order or another. The reason for this is a little bit technical and has to do with a concept called hashing. But that's why whenever you iterate over an object, you can't expect it to be in a particular order. Now, if you sort it, then you can force it to be into an order. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and then I guess the question would be how you, so to sort it, it would be just another function you have to make and manually sort whatever keys inside an object, I'm assuming.
Yes, there's some built-in stuff for that, and I'm sure we'll cover that later. I don't want to derail the discussion.
Awesome. All right. So now let's go ahead and continue moving on, and let's move into our iteration now. We've hit quite a bit about JavaScript so far, but iteration is probably going to be the most useful tool that we're going to be going over. So there's a couple of ways to implement iteration. And I'm going to go ahead and start with a string. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let my var be equal to, this is now just a string. Again, that is an iterable data type. That means I can iterate through all of its indexes, and console.log where the location that I'm currently in, or maybe console.log the actual content of the location that I'm currently in, or maybe there's some sort of behavior I want to do in order to mutate my string. Not exactly sure, but let's go ahead and get this for loop going. So if I want to create a for loop that mimics the range function, and I'm going to assume that everybody here is more directed with Python at this point. And if you're not, that's okay. We are going to be covering this tomorrow as well. So in Python, you would do something like for IDX in range, and then you would call the length of the actual string, my var, right? Well, this range function would just create a list of integers for the string, for the string's length. So if it was, you know, if it was 8 characters long, then it would create a list going all the way up to 8. And this for loop would just iterate from 0 all the way up. Well, how do I mimic this behavior in JavaScript, right? Not necessarily mimic, but how do I enforce this behavior in JavaScript? Well, in JavaScript, what I can do is say, for, I'm going to let I be equal to 0. So rather than utilizing the range function to create this list for me and manually creating a iterator or something that's going to jump from 0 all the way to 8. All right, so now I've created my iterator. And I'm going to say, while I is less than my var dot length. All right, well, just like I took the length of my var here and said, hey, this is going to go all the way up to 8. I'm going to say you're going to repeat the block of code in this process until I is no longer less than my length. Well, if that's the case, then I want I plus plus. Now, I plus plus essentially means that I'm going to add 1 to I at the end of this. All right, so let's start off by just console.logging I. And I'm going to go ahead and also log on to the console, my var.length, so that we can see this. So my var.length is actually 24 characters long, or 25 characters long, I apologize. And in those 25 characters, since we started at 0, we can see that I get 25 iterations. It goes all the way up to 24. Again, we started from 0. That's a total of 25 iterations. So what happens here? So let I equal 0. All right, I know that I is 0. And I'm saying while 0 is less than the length of my variable, which is 25, I want you to execute this block of code. So I console.logs 0. Now, after you execute this block of code, I want you to add 1 to I. And that's how on the next iteration, we get 1. On the next one, we get 2, and so on, all the way down till 24. Does anyone have any questions about this iteration process and how it mimics the for I, the for index in range? I believe there was a question regarding this earlier, so I hope this clarified that question. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, that was definitely me. I was just asking if it were similar to Python in terms of like using range and adding, you know, the next index basically. That was it. Nothing big.
Okay, fantastic. So now we got this information, we're able to work through it and grab the individual index, all right? I personally like to, rather than naming this I name it IDX. I know it's not necessarily common, but the reason why I do that, and I recommend people do that, is because, again, variables are very important. If you just start naming I and J and K for each individual loop that you do, things are going to get really confusing. You don't want that. Try to make this somewhat descriptive of what exactly it is that it's representing, right? In this case, it's representing the index that I'm currently located. So since I know that, I can say, well, what if I want to just console.log the index of that specific letter? Well, there we can see that, again, our first log onto our console is our length, which is 25. And then it logs each individual letter onto my console. And there is my for loop. All right, any questions regarding the for loop one more time?
I have a question, but it might get a little sidetracky. So in Python, you can do for variable in the list or the array itself. Can you do that same functionality in JavaScript? Just to completely avoid the range function and iterating on the index values completely.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Let's go ahead and get into that next. All right, so we just covered one way of doing our for loops. All right, and that's supposed to mimic the for index in range. But what if I was doing something like for character in my var? Right, that would automatically start iterating through each one of the characters. Well, how could I do that in JavaScript? In JavaScript, I'm basically going to do the same exact behavior. I'm going to establish a for loop. I'm going to say let character of my var. And then I'm just going to simply console.log that character. And now when I execute, I still get the same exact behavior where it's iterating through each one of the characters inside of my string. Does that answer your question, Brandon? All right, I see the thumbs up. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
So what is, in I guess the workforce, what is more appropriate to use, or does it matter what we use?
That's a great question. So when it comes to workforce, I think any for loop is necessarily acceptable as long as your syntax is clean. But what I would like everybody to consider when they're choosing their loops is not necessarily the end state, but what you need access to, right? So here's what I mean by that. In my first example of my for loop, not only did I have access to my string and I was able to grab the specific letter at that location of the index, but I had access to the index itself, right? I was actually able to grab the index that I'm currently located at. In this secondary for loop, I do not have access to the index itself. I just have access to all of the elements, but not the current index. I could write some extra code in there or try to make it more specific where it will give me that, but it won't give me that automatically. So it's all user preference, right? Whichever one works most effectively for the specific scenario that you're working to. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes. Okay. And I know we are gonna go over how to test or what's the most efficient way to code, I guess, later in the course. So I'm just curious, yeah, I guess scenario basis, which one would be more effective by either functionality, speed, and accuracy, I guess. I don't know.
Yes, we'll be covering all that shortly as we move on. All right, and then I saw a couple of hands that were up and then they all started going down. So I know Brandon had his hand up, so I'm not gonna let you run away. What's up, Brandon?
No, I was just gonna ask if there was a difference in time complexity, but then you said we're gonna talk about it later.
Fantastic. All right. Len? You're muted.
Double mutes, man, it sucks. All right, so I know we're using a string here, and strings are a type of array, like a special character case of array. So when you use the let char of my var, I mean, that can be used for any JavaScript array.
Yeah, that's a great question. It can be used for any iterable data type. All right. Any other questions? I could have swore I saw one more.
Yeah, he's looking at you, Tim.
Oh, there you go. Ratted him out. What's up, Tim?
I did have a question, but you kind of answered it and you kind of just said that you're going to go over the stuff that I wanted to hear anyway. So don't worry about it.
All right. Okay. So now there's one more thing that I would like to cover here in this for let, right? Well, in Python, I utilize the for and, So what happens if I do for in instead of for of? Well, there's the difference. If I utilize for in instead of for of, I get the index numbers. I don't get the actual letters. Whereas if I utilize for of, I get the letters themselves and not the index. So for in gives me the index, for of will give me the actual element. All right. So now we've covered a little bit of that. Let's go ahead and start talking about our more. Let's turn this into an array really quick. Actually, I just want to show this. So let's have my array of numbers real quick. It's still utilizing the same variable. If I do for in, I guess for of will still show me the contents, which they're numbers in this case. So just to make sure that this isn't confusing, let me go ahead and alternate these numbers a little bit. Go ahead, Brandon.
Instead of having it input on a new line, unless you specifically want to do that, could we just like add a space to the output? That way it's all in one line, because right now your terminal is massive, and I do prefer to have like a bigger code space at the, like I like the terminal to be smaller. I know that might not be everybody's preference, but just so that we could also see the output, making it on one line.
How would you like it to be in one line? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I know how to do that for this one.
To whenever it console logs to not print a new line.
Yeah. Are you waiting for me? I'm asking you, how do I do that?
Oh yeah, I don't think you can do that in Python with the comma and equal space, but in JavaScript you have to turn it into a string and concatenate it.
All right. Okay, so continuing on here, we have our numbers. We're able to iterate through them. Everything works exactly the same. Again, it is an iterable structure. If I had strings here, all right, and let's just go ahead and kind of add some random strings, and I were to iterate, it would still work. It would iterate through the array itself. And if I wanted to iterate through each one of these, I can say for, and instead of char, I'm actually going to utilize word in this case. Then I can say for let char of word, and I can say console.log char. Right, and actually let's go ahead and also console.log the word. So there's my nested loop. I'm gonna go ahead and iterate through this. I can see that the word is what gets console.log on my outer loop. Then it goes into my inner loop and starts iterating through each one of those characters. All right, does anyone have any questions about iteration?
I do.
All right, let's hear it, Rosa.
Can you go over the iterating through an object?
Yes, we will be covering that here shortly.
Okay.
All right, let's go ahead and go into iterations of an object. And I'm actually going to use my employee object that I have up here just so that we don't have to create a brand new one. All right, so here I have my object. Again, it's a key value pair. It allows me to have immediate access to each one of those values as long as I have the correct key. So let's go ahead and start going through these values. So now, if I go ahead and say for, And let's go ahead and just do let key of employee. And let's say console.log my key. Well, when I run this, I get an error. It's telling me, hey, employee is not iterable. But why isn't it iterable? I thought it would be. Well, it turns out an object is not an actual iterable data structure. I have to turn it into something else. So in order to do that, I'm going to utilize the object method to grab the entries. So let's go ahead and go over that. Let's say object dot, and here we can see that it already gives me a couple of things, right? It gives me keys, assigned. There's entries in there as well. Quite a bit of things here. So let's see what happens if I do keys. Let's say employee dot keys. I wonder if that will work here. All right, so that didn't work. So it looks like we have to do object dot entries. And then I have to specify what object is that I'm looking at. Well, I'm looking at the employee object. Let's see what that returns. Nice. Well, that's actually pretty cool. Now, when I did this, it not only turned my object into an array, it also turned each one of my key value pairs into an array themselves. So now I just have an array of arrays. Well, let's see what happens if I try to iterate through this information here. So again, this is what object.entries does. It took my actual object and turned it into an array of arrays. So let's say let, and just to make this a little bit more clear, because it should be an array, I'm going to go through my object.entries of employee. And then I'm just going to console.log that specific array. All right, so there you go. I get my first console.log, which shows me my array of arrays. And then after that, I can see that I have my entries there. All right, so that's working pretty well. Now, there's two specific ways that I can change this or manipulate this. We could utilize something called destructuring to grab this specific array. I know that it's going to come back in twos, but it looks like that's not covered in this portion of the lecture, so I don't want to go into it just yet. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and assign them independent variables. I'm going to say my key is equal to my array at index 0, and my value is equal to my array at index 1. And now if I console.log my key for each one of them, we can see only the keys get logged. And if I console log my value for each one of them, we can see only my values get logged. We'll come back into this once we cover object destructuring, but we'll pause at this point in regards to how to iterate through an object. All right, does anyone have any questions up to this part about iterating through an object? Oh, go ahead, Eroshan.
So there's really no difference using a for off and for in the iterating through objects.
Well, let's try that. All right, let's say we do, and I'm just gonna comment this out here. And let's do key again. And let's just try to do employee for now. All right. We try to execute this, and I go into my for in. We see that if I do a for in loop, it's actually able to grab all of my keys. It's not able to grab indexes because I don't have indexes inside of an object. It's just grabbing keys. So this is grabbing me all of my keys, but it's not necessarily what I want when it comes to an object. I would want to have access to both the key and value pair. This is how you can iterate through an object to just grab keys. Does that answer your question, Eroshan?
Yes.
All right. All right, if there are no other questions, I'm gonna quickly cover some ternary statements. And then from there, we'll go and move into functions. All right, so ternary statements. Let's say I have a variable here. I'm gonna call this a variable. And I want this variable to have a value depending on depending on a specific condition. So I want this to say, well, let me go ahead and think about this one a little bit. So if I do let a variable be equal to true, and then I say, well, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and run a condition on a var. If a var is true, I want you to console.log, or actually, let's say that true variable. So if a var is true, I'm going to go ahead and pass back this is true. And if it isn't, so my else statement, I will say this is false. So again, this is essentially running in one specific line. If my condition, a var, I'm going to say true var is equal to this is true. Else, I'm going to say true var is equal to this is false. Let me try to move this back a little bit. So this is what I'm trying to write in one line. It's my ternary statement. If I go ahead and console.log my true var now, we'll see this is true, and I apologize. I should have commented out this code up here. All right, we see that this is true. If I run this and turn this into false, and then execute my code, we can see that now it says this is false. Again, it evaluates the conditions here on the left-hand side. So if I say 10 is greater than 11, it's going to tell me this is false. And if I say 10 is greater than 8, it will also tell me this is true. Does anyone have any questions regarding ternary statements? And I heard the pop. Who is it? All right, go ahead, Erjan.
So with ternary operators, can you only do two comparisons? You can't add like an if else and that one, like a third one or a fourth comparison to like, oh, this is not true or neither false.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's go ahead and go into that, right? So here's my first ternary operator. So I have is 10 greater than 8? Well, if 10 is greater than 8, then I want it to be true. Otherwise, I want to say, well, what if this 10 is actually less than 11, right? And actually, let's do it this way. 10 greater than 11. All right, well, we know that's going to be false. So otherwise, is 10 greater than 11? Well, no, it isn't. So it's 10 less than 10. Perfect. And I'll say this is from my else if. And then finally, I'll end it with this is false. All right, so if I run this, we can see the first statement of 10 greater than 11 came back as false. So it didn't trigger my first statement here. It went into the second evaluation here on the right-hand side. which again had a ternary statement. I asked, hey, is 10 less than 11? Well, that came back true. So I get back a return of this is from my else if. Right, I'm essentially just nesting it as a child. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. Let's move on to functions at this point, everybody. So we've gone over how to utilize all of these different methods, but we haven't covered functions just yet. And functions are going to be great to go into the topic of return statements as well. So here's my function, right? Or my function machine. I'm sure everybody has seen this drawing one point or another. Let me go ahead and turn that upside down there. All right, so the function takes in some sort of input. And my function, and this part's important, it may return an output. It could not return an output at all. And it actually could just not take in an input if it's not necessary, right? But the function itself will just conduct a series of steps. And I think the most common thing that I always see is like f of x is equal to x plus 2 or something like that. Right? So that's like the simplest mathematical way, or from that I can scratch from my memory that explains a function. Well, how do I turn this specific little block here into some JavaScript code? All right. Well, all this is doing is it's saying I have a function. I'm going to call this function add2. And here I have this x. Well, that stands for a variable. So I know this is supposed to be a number. That will be my input. X is my input. And all I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to console.log num plus 2. And actually, rather than console.logging it, I'm going to say result is equal to 1 num plus 2. So there it is. I created a function. And I'm going to go ahead and console.log result. Well, now when I call this function here, let's say add 2, and I pass in the number 5. Well, when I execute my script now, my script should show me the number 7. And it does. So now I have a question for everybody. I'm seeing the number 7 on my console or my terminal, but is my function right now producing an output?
No.
No, my function is not producing an output, right? Is my function taking in an input?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So my function is taking in an input, which is my number, right? Again, it's not necessary. I could just leave this completely empty and then type in a number myself. But currently I am taking in an input, but my function is not producing an output. Now it's a little confusing. Well, we're saying that my function is not producing an output, but I'm seeing an output out here. Well, let's talk about what that means, right? I'm going to go ahead and say result. I'm going to make a let result of function be equal to add2. And then I'm going to console.log my result of the function. All right, so I'm going to execute this. So my function gets executed. I still see the number 7. But when I go to console.log the result of a function, I get undefined. Why is that? Why do I see undefined?
And you're not returning anything from the function.
Yeah, my function isn't producing an output. So I'm telling this variable result of function to hold on to the output of my function. But there isn't any coming out. There's nothing being returned, so my variable is not holding on to anything. Right? I'm not explicitly telling it that it's null, but my variable knows it's supposed to exist. So it just comes back as undefined. Doesn't know. Oh, go ahead.
Because the variable not inside the function scope, you didn't define it inside the function?
No, what you're talking about is scope. We'll go into that here shortly as well. So now I have my function, right? I'm grabbing the return. I'm trying to grab the return statement, but there is no return. So in order to fix that, I have to tell my function, hey, you actually have to produce an output, right? You're not just here to exist. You're here to produce an output. And what I want you to produce is the result. Well, now, rather than console.logging the result within the function, I am returning that value to my variable and then logging it to my console, which is why we see 7 and undefined is now gone. All right, I see a question from Tim. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, can you put the return statement in the same line as the let result equal num plus 2? Or does it need to be separate lines?
You're saying like place it in here?
Yeah, just return, and then I'm not sure what the syntax is if you need to put brackets or anything like that, but is that possible?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, there you go.
Awesome. All right. So now I have my specific information there, all right? And I'm able to do result, but Murid had a really good question about scope. All right, so what is scope? Well, there's something called global scope, and then there's something called functional scope. And sorry, not functional, local. And the way that I like to think about this is, oh, is there a question?
Block scope.
Oh, Mikhail, could you say that a little louder? I apologize.
Is that block scope?
Block scope? Yeah. All right. So now, if I have my input function here, right? Everything that exists within this machine only exists inside of it, right? So I could say that there's bolts. I can say that there's maybe some materials, et cetera, right? But let's just say we keep it to bolts and gears, all right? That's my machine itself. Well, inside of the entire shop, is there something that resembles a house? There isn't. All right. Inside of the entire shop, maybe I have wood and material. Oh man, can I draw wood? I'm not gonna be able to draw wood. Why did I choose wood out of anything? I'm just gonna go ahead and make a little block here, make that yellow and put in some filler, and there's our wood, everyone. All right. All right, so now in the scope of things, the shop itself is aware that the wood exists, right? And the machine can look outside into the shop and be aware of everything that's within the shop. But we, as people within the shop, cannot see everything that's within the machine, right? So currently, my machine, my add to function machine here, has one specific bolt and gear named result. Well, if I go outside to my script, which is essentially the entire shop, and I try to console.log result, I expect to get an error. Now, this error is coming in, it's saying result is not defined, right? And maybe that's happening because I don't have a let. Let's try to clean that up a little bit. But no, I still get the same error. Now, even though result is being created or initialized on line 96, it's not being created where I have access to it in the entire script or for the entire shop. It only exists in the contents of this function. And that's the reason why when I run console.log result, it fails. And let's show an example of it vice versa, right? Let's say that I have something like this is a, oh, I'm messing that all up. Let's say that I have something like a number. And I turn this a number into 33. Oh, wow, I can't spell number. All right. So I turn this number into 33. Again, if I try to console.log result on the outside of that function, it's going to throw an error because it doesn't exist. All right, the shop is not aware of the insides of the machine. But if I try to console.log a number, even though I'm not passing it in to my function, oh, I'm not calling the function. That's important. Even though I'm not calling it into my function or passing it in as a parameter of the function, it's still able to grab that variable and console.log it as if it existed within it. Well, this is because this is in a global scope of my script. It exists throughout the entire shop. Everybody can see it. And everything within my machine is within my local or block scope. All right, and then I saw someone's hand up. I'm not sure who that was, but we are opening for questions at this time. Any questions, anyone? All right, if there aren't any questions, let's go ahead and move on into, I believe there was one more thing that I wanted to cover, which were our arrow functions, but it looks like arrow functions are not part of this lecture as well. It's already about to be 12 o'clock, so this feels like a natural stopping point. So far, we have covered primitive data types, variables, functions, complex data types, the ternary statement, loops, and we have not gone into arrow functions just yet. So I'll move that over into the advanced section. All right. Does anyone have any questions over any of the topics that we covered during part 1 of our lecture today? All right, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.